For as long as human beings have taken to the stage to perform, folklore, legends, and myths have inspired. With the creation of film at the end of the 19th century, an eager audience was bestowed mythological landscapes, fantastic heroes, and stunning effects like nothing they had seen before. In 1924, Germany created some of the most innovative and intriguing movies globally. The country was struggling to rebuild economically and emotionally after war. It was in these unsettling times that the new, thriving young director Fritz Lang decided to bring Germany's national epic Die Nibelungen to the big screen. Running close to 5 hours and released in 2 separate parts, the choice of screen adapting a classic tale of medieval gallantry, dragons, curses, betrayal and revenge might have seemed like a bold choice to a director known for a recent hit crime thriller. However, Fritz Lang and his screenwriter and recently wedded wife Thea von Harbo felt that the ancient fable resonated with the defeated people of Weimar Germany. Germany was still in hyperinflation while paying despised war reparations. The Dawes Plan, which would bring the country a respite from its economic woes, was still several months away. So throughout the film's lengthy production, anger and the sense of deep betrayal were increasingly prevalent. This is a period where a loaf of bread reached 1 billion marks. There was high-profile assassinations and a series of violent political uprisings. The film is dedicated to the German people, and the initial sentiment behind the production was to embolden the nation and stoke up national pride. Lang wouldn't have known that his film would be used as a tool for the most evil regime in history to project its vile ideology. A Die Nibelungen is based on the Die Nibelungen Lied, an epic poem imagined a millennium ago. The central characters were inspired by ancient historical figures such as Attila the Hun, Sigurd I, and Brunhilde of Austrasia from the 4th to 6th century. The tales were developed in the Germanic and North traditions and were first written down in the 12th century. Substantially lost and forgotten for a couple of centuries, it was rediscovered mid-18th century as German nationalism arose. By the time of German unification in 1870, the classic poem was hailed as the German Iliad, and it would find its most famous interpretation through Richard Wagner's operatic Ring Cycle. However, Wagner's opera took more inspiration from various Norse sagas, and the poem's events only come to pass in the final opera. The anti-Semitic Wagner, who created controversy with his views even in his own lifetime, was celebrated for exalting the virtues of German nationalism. So over the decades, Die Nibelungen was honoured for its chivalric heroism, and Siegfried increasingly symbolised the German ideal as a Teutonic Apollo or King Arthur. The Viennese-born Fritz Lang had recently become a German citizen, and with the country in despair and Hollywood beginning to establish itself at the German box office, he felt the film would bring a sense of pride to the nation. Lang was keen not to evoke Wagner as he wasn't a fan. However, elements of the Ring Cycle, like Siegfried's nature boy persona, made it into the script. Also serving as inspiration was a 19th century stage adaptation written by Friedrich Hebel and which von Harbo had performed in years before. However, the primary source remains the original epic poem. The complete film is 5 hours and it was split into 2. Usually titled Siegfried or Siegfried's Death and Kriemhilde's Revenge. The films were released 2 months apart, with production lasting 9 grueling months. This promised to be an epic film that could rival anything Hollywood had to offer. The saga opens with Siegfried, a naive forest-dwelling warrior with sword skills, who, upon hearing stories of the virtuous, stately Kriemhilde, sister of King Gunther of Burgundy, decides to win her heart. On the way to the Burgundy court at Worms, Siegfried slays a dragon and bathes in its blood on the advice of a bird, which means he becomes invincible to all attacks. However, a lime leaf falls on his shoulder whilst he's showering, exposing a vulnerable spot. This scene was a true standout for the period. At 60 metres long and coated with an incredibly heavy vulcanised rubber, the dragon was controlled by 10 men, and the scene took weeks to perfect. Siegfried actor Paul Richter was injured in the process of shooting the scene. The dragon is still an example of impressive film puppetry, a distant forerunner to the original Jabba the Hutt in Return of the Jedi. The only issue I have is the dragon actually looks quite agreeable, and it's minding its own business when Siegfried decides to kill it, because why not? On a side note, Richter clashed with Lang throughout the filming of the dragon scene, especially when asked to disrobe to bathe in the dragon's blood. Lang regular Thea von Harbaugh's ex-husband and King Etzel actor Rudolf Klein-Rogge volunteered to double for the lead in this one contentious shot. Further on, Siegfried travels through the misty land of the Nibelungen and is violently confronted by the dwarf king Alberich. When Siegfried overpowers him, Alberich offers his magical cloak of invisibility and transformation, as well as the substantial Nibelungen treasure if his life is spared. While Siegfried smugly inspects his newly obtained prize, Alberich attempts to kill him, just to be once again thwarted, this time stabbed. Before dying, Alberich curses all those who inherit the Nibelungen treasure. Alberich and his serfs all turn to stone once Siegfried seizes their treasure, an impressive effect that still holds up today. Unfortunately, the characterisation of Alberich does not. Even when the film was released, critics commented on the depiction of Alberich as an anti-Semitic stereotype, complete with grotesque makeup by Otto Geneth. Critic and Lang's friend Lotte Eisner would defend the half-Jewish Lang and Erich Palmer, the Jewish producer, from these accusations. Alberich is played by one of Lang's most regular performers, Georg John, who plays two other roles in the epic, and perhaps the extreme makeup was required to disguise his very distinctive features. However, this still makes for uncomfortable viewing, as it's very likely a Weimar audience would extract anti-Jewish sentiment from these scenes. Siegfried eventually arrives at Worms, announcing himself as King of the 12 Kingdoms, and is met with suspicion by Hagen of Tronje, the loyal vassal of King Gunther. Tensions rise until Princess Kriemhilde enters. Immediately before his arrival, Kriemhilde discusses a foreboding dream she had where a white dove is attacked by two dark-winged falcons, possibly symbolising Hagen and Brunhilde, the only two characters with dark clothes and winged helmets. This is an impressive piece of early animation by abstract filmmaker Walter Ruttmann, very much in the same vein as his Lichtspiel Opus 1 a few years earlier. Instantly smitten, Siegfried asks for her hand in marriage, and in exchange he will help secure Gunther his desired bride, the mighty Brunhilde, Queen of Iceland. To win the queen, Gunther must better her in 3 contests of strength, which will be difficult because he's as strong as a wet cardboard box full of bricks. With the assistance of Siegfried and his invisibility cloak, Gunther basically cheats his way to victory. Devastated, Brunhilde miserably returns to Worms as Gunther's queen. However, she refuses to submit to her husband in the bedchamber. Affronted by this petulance, Hagen and Gunther again demand that Siegfried physically break her will. This time, employing Alberich's cloak to shapeshift into Gunther, Siegfried overpowers Brunhilde, only to leave for the authentic Gunther to complete the violation. To spare Gunther's blushes, Hagen demands an oath of secrecy from Siegfried. However, this doesn't last long, as Siegfried confesses everything to his bride. Kriemhilde isn't overly concerned with her husband's involvement in forcibly deflowering her sister-in-law, but she tells Brunhilde the truth in a petty squabble. Brunhilde, understandably, wants revenge. The character may have been perceived as shrewish at the time, but Brunhilde is truly a tragic figure that has been cruelly deceived, and one feels empathy towards her. Hannah Ralph gives an intriguing, dynamic performance. On the surface, Brunhilde is fierce and vengeful, but we can really feel how her clipped wings affect her. Latterly, she seems remorseful and disgusted at herself for plotting the downfall of Siegfried. She's undoubtedly the most complex character in the first part of the saga. Outraged by the betrayal and fueled by Brunhilde's claim that Siegfried went further than they requested, Hagen plots to kill Siegfried with Gunther's reluctant approval. A hunting trip is arranged for the court, and Hagen tricks Kriemhilde into revealing where the lime leaf fell upon Siegfried, exposing his weak spot. Siegfried bends over to drink from a sparkling stream during the hunt, only to be impaled by a spear thrown by Hagen. When Siegfried's body is returned to Worms, Brunhilde feels vengeance is somewhat hollow and commits suicide, while the devastated Kriemhilde realises that Hagen has orchestrated the assassination. She demands that Gunther and her other brothers avenge her husband's death. Even though most of the court and her brothers genuinely adored Siegfried, their loyalty is with Hagen, down to a feudalistic code of honour which takes precedence over their feelings. It's not a surprise that Die Nibelungen Part 1, Siegfried's Death, was initially a commercial and critical success. It was a film that a depressed Germany could be proud of, and it was competition to Hollywood. The whole movie has a beautiful golden tint, as if we're viewing an ancient artifact, and a highly evocative score by Gottfried Huberts add to this romance. Front and centre is Siegfried, heroically framed with his statuesque physique filling the screen, his athleticism and blonde hair uncomfortably making him an embodiment of the Aryan ideal. Siegfried is encompassed by nature, a very stylised form of nature, inspired by artists such as Arnold Böcklin and the romantic landscapes of Caspar David Friedrich. Lotte Eisner in The Haunted Screen would claim that nature and landscapes were of dramaturgical importance in German film, writing, "The veil separating Nordic man from nature cannot be torn down, so the Germans, narcissistic in the extreme, construct an artificial nature." Throughout the film, we understand Siegfried is coded as virtuous as he's framed with plenty of flora and fauna. He is at one with nature. Dominating the landscape he rides despite the towering trees, communicating with birds, and being surrounded by flowers. Another of Kriemhilde's expressionistic visions see her husband alive, surrounded by a floral thicket before the bush alters to a skull at the news of Siegfried's death. Siegfried's parentage is fleetingly mentioned once in the film, but it is implied that he is born out of the forest. In her essay From Iron Age Myth to Idealised Landscape, Susan Power Bratton notes, Siegfried emerges not as a young feudal lord but as a product of a highly dramatised German landscape. Later, National Socialism would similarly ignore family ties and treat children as products of the German fatherland and of the healthy German soil. However, Lang also frames characters with a critical lens, and the great national hero doesn't escape this ambivalence. Siegfried is arrogant and imperious. His innocence is not a virtue, it's a catalyst for disaster. He unquestionably defeats and deceives Brunhilde for his own gain. To a modern eye, it's hard to be impressed with his unwarranted attack on the dragon. And then there's the unfair advantage he has over his assault of Alberich, which proves to be profitable as he automatically helps himself to the treasure. From a non-Germanic 21st century perspective, where we have superheroes coming out our ears, it's really hard to understand why this swaggering mercenary is considered a hero. Initially, Siegfried conquers each obstacle that he comes across, slaying the dragon and Alberich. While those supernatural challenges are fundamental to his journey, human nature and the characters we meet at the Burgundy court contribute to his downfall. Gunther's weakness and Hagen's treachery destroy Siegfried. These characters were read by some as an embodiment of the Weimar leaders. Each version of the tale has Siegfried die with a spear to the back. He is stabbed in the back. It's this analogy that the Nazis would really engage with. They wanted the German people to see themselves as Siegfried, good people that had been stabbed in the back by the Weimar government and its signing of the Treaty of Versailles. It was the early days of Nazism, and while things would ease in the country within a year, the metaphor would grow in significance, especially when the Nazi regime would take over nearly a decade later. Fritz Lang thrived on spectacle, with Siegfried's death focusing on the fantastic elements of the legend, which not only called for impressive special effects, but awe-inspiring visuals, from the enduring forest to the imposing Schloss bathed in spellbinding light. A visual perfectionist, Lang was still editing the film at the actual premiere in February 1924, causing chaos with the orchestra, missing cues, and delayed reels. Lang was inspired by German artists such as Hans Thoma, Wilhelm von Kaulbach, and Arnold Böckling's Island of the Dead and The Silence of the Forest. The grandiosity of the courtly scenes, while visually striking, were designed to contrast with the folksy Siegfried. The Burgundians' costumes, designed by Ian Vilcom, fuse contemporary 1920s fashion with traditional medieval, abstract yet orderly. The distinctive design leaves a cold, antagonistic impression. However, it's the visual pageantry of the Burgundian court worms that would be surveyed in coming years as a foreboding prototype to Nazi propaganda. In the influential book From Caligari to Hitler, writer Siegfried Kracauer theorises that Lang's aesthetic was the complete triumph of the ornamental over the human. Absolute authority asserts itself by arranging people under its domination in pleasing designs. This can also be seen with the Nazi regime, which manifested strong ornamental inclinations in organising masses. By the conclusion of Die Nibelungen Part 1, the fantasy and grandeur have come to nothing. Our apparent hero is gone, and with it, the magic. The death of Siegfried is merely the precursor for the bloodbath that is to come. Kriemhilde's Revenge, released 2 months after Part 1, begins in the aftermath of Siegfried's death. The once chaste, almost celestial Kriemhilde is now a grieving, detached widow seeking revenge. Much to the anguish of the court, she rejects everyone as Hagen is still protected. Initially, she attempts to bribe the people of Burgundy using the Nibelungen treasure in the hope they will rise against Hagen. Suspecting her plot, Hagen secretly dumps the loot into the Rhine. Rudiger von Bechelaren, a vassal for King Etzel, also known as Attila the Hun, visits Worms on Etzel's behalf to ask for the hand of Kriemhilde in marriage. Despite her grief and initial refusal, Kriemhilde accepts the proposal, demanding, in the process, that both men pledge an oath to defend any betrayal of her honour. Kriemhilde arrives in the land of the Huns, where she is met with a kingdom that dramatically contrasts with Worms. The Hun city is represented as primitive compared to the Burgundy court, and its inhabitants are framed as grotesque, drunk savages. When Kriemhilde finally comes face to face with her new husband, it's clear she's disgusted and is only in this situation as a means to an end. Many of the scenes involving the Hun make for uncomfortable viewing. It's implied there is a racial divide between Kriemhilde, the German, and King Etzel, though this difference is confusing because the makeup is so outlandish. Historically, the nomadic people known as the Hun derived from Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Arguably, the film is warning the Germans of the threat from the East, demonising the people. However, this interpretation can be challenged when we observe the character of Etzel. He is arguably the most humane character in the whole saga. Blinded by his love for Kriemhilde, he is credulous, oblivious of her intentions. Etzel is overjoyed when the couple have a child, whereas Kriemhilde is revolted. When the Burgundian court visits Kriemhilde and her child, Etzel is a congenial host. He has his own code of ethics and reasonably rejects his wife's demand to kill Hagen, and is bewildered by Gunther and Hagen dressing in full armour for dinner. We are in for a very different film from the first. Gone are the dragons, dwarves, the magic, and in their place is a savage epic born of fire and fury. Marguerite Schoen's dramatic metamorphosis as Kriemhilde is astounding. As a loyal, virtuous wife, one would be forgiven for believing Kriemhilde to be a cliched virtuous maiden that acts as a prize for Siegfried to win. However, as a widow, Kriemhilde embodies rage and hatred. Kriemhilde abandons the virginal bridal whites and dainty smile for a widow's harsh, dark clothing and a striking glare. In Kriemhilde's Revenge, Margaret Schoen's unique performance transmits pure hateful dominance, and she achieves this with a series of micro-expressions and stillness that's chilling. One slight movement from her heavy brow can spell doom for hundreds. Schoen's powerhouse performance dominates the film as Kriemhilde does the Huns. Obsessed, stone cold and deadly, Kriemhilde is visually reminiscent of the Black Queen on a chessboard, potentially the most dangerous piece. It's with this motif that we should perhaps view Kriemhilde's Revenge, as the whole film revolves around Kriemhilde's manipulative manoeuvres to avenge Siegfried. Her one goal is to remove Hagen, and she is determined to succeed at the expense of everyone. When Etzel refuses to kill Hagen, Kriemhilde speaks directly to the Huns, bribing them to attack the Burgundian. As the onslaught commences, Etzel brings his young son into the hall at Kriemhilde's suggestion. When Gunther and Hagen become aware that the Huns have assaulted their men, Hagen swiftly slaughters the child. It's probable that Kriemhilde knew this would happen. The remainder of the film is a brutal 50-minute massacre. Kriemhilde stands solitary and stone-faced as former kith and kin fall one by one. She coldly demands that Rudiger fulfill the oath he once made to her, resulting in him painfully killing his son-in-law, who's also Kriemhilde's brother. With Etzel's hall now an inferno, and Hagen still standing, Kriemhilde's indifference is oppressive. Any amount of sympathy we have left evaporates. The pacing and staging of these scenes are astounding. The exhausted actors were put at a significant risk amongst the actual flames. Lang had torched the sets himself, with the local fire brigade at the side. As the saga concludes, it's down to Kriemhilde herself to strike down Hagen. With her enemy, her child, her brothers, and both courts dead, Kriemhilde has nothing else to live for, and is swiftly killed by Swordmaster Hildebrand, permitting the beheading of Gunther, destroying Etzel's kingdom, her indifference at the death of her child and brothers, and the cool execution of Hagen. Kriemhilde has gone from victim to monster. On its release, Kriemhilde's Revenge proved to be distasteful to many Germans. According to Lang biographer Paul Jensen, the film's first showing in Germany was halted by protests from the audience against the final sequence of Kriemhilde's murders. The viewers were offended at seeing their nationalistic heroine so besmirched. A decade later, with the rise of the Nazis, the saga of Siegfried was re-released with a narration recorded by Theodor Luz, and a new soundtrack incorporating some of Wagner's score. On that occasion, Kriemhilde's Revenge was left in the vault. Siegfried's death was celebrated for its beautiful and enigmatic nature, the nationalistic hero, and the tragedy that occurred due to treason. Its narrative and accompanying aesthetic were attractive to the coming evil regime. The conclusion of Siegfried's death demands retribution. Kriemhilde's Revenge is a response to that demand, as we are subjected to an all-out apocalypse where no one wins, and the few left standing are broken. To a Nazi, this film would not fit in with their agenda, as it's not a request for bloody retribution or warmongering. Kriemhilde's Revenge demonstrates that revenge is not cathartic, but ominous. From a modern perspective, I've enjoyed Kriemhilde's Revenge the more I've watched it. Having to wait a couple of months back in the day probably didn't help the film's prospects, but watching it back to back with Siegfried, the full Die Nibelungen saga makes one feel as if they've gone on an incredible, fantastic, but ultimately devastating journey. Siegfried may be the more influential and mystical, with astonishing hypnotic beauty. However, there is something simplistic about the story, and our perceptions of the characters are well defined. We know where our sympathies lie. Kriemhilde's Revenge throws these perceptions to the wind, and the characters have become more complex. Our sympathies and misgivings for each are blurred. We understand and pity Kriemhilde for wanting revenge, yet are stunned by how far she'll go. We loathe Hagen for his portrayal of Siegfried and the murder of a child, yet are surprised when he's willing to sacrifice himself to protect the king. The second film takes our perceptions and flips them on their heads, and we are kept guessing until the end. Fritz Lang's Die Nibelungen is one of the most spectacular, visually pleasing films made of the silent era. It's a fascinating watch. We are greatly lured by its adventure and whimsical mystique. It's easy to understand why depressed and defeated people were seduced by it. However, when the foreboding doom transcends upon the characters, it is tragic that audiences did not take heed. The legacy of Die Nibelungen is forever tied with the fascination it held for the most evil men in history. The German people that the film encouraged and all the artists involved in its creation are long gone, mere ghosts on a screen. I believe artistic intentions should be and need to be queried and discussed, especially when talking about art in a historical context. However, to watch the film today, we can also marvel at the groundbreaking cinematography, the fantastic characters, epic storytelling, and the insanely imaginative sets. In the decades that have passed, other film directors would build upon the foundations laid by Lang, especially in the past 20 years with Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings or even Game of Thrones. However, Die Nibelungen is the first fantasy epic. It's trailblazing and still impresses, especially when you realise that this film was produced in dire economic circumstances by starving people struggling with the most basic resources. There is a lot of genuine and understandable discomfort surrounding the film, yet as a fan of folklore and fantasy films, I'm still grateful that this film inspires on both the big and small screen.